Power did not announce itself when Mike Johnson entered a room. It adjusted quietly, instinctively, as if the air recognized him before people did. Meetings shifted to his rhythm. Decisions bent toward his preference. Outcomes followed him like loyal shadows. At 38, Mike had reached a level of influence that most men only spoke about in hypotheticals, self-made, globally positioned, and insulated from the word no. Hi family, I need you to please help subscribe and watch my video to the end. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Let us continue. He had not inherited his fortune. He had built it with a precision that bordered on obsession. Long before the money came, there was discipline. Long before admiration followed, there was control. Mike believed in order, structured risk, calculated moves, emotional restraint. Chaos was inefficient. Sentiment was negotiable. Everything to him had a price or a purpose. People described him as charming, though charm was not something he consciously practiced. It came from confidence sharpened by consistency. He spoke when necessary. He listened when it benefited him. He knew when to step forward and when to step back, and the balance made him dangerous. In business, competitors feared him not because he raised his voice, but because he never had to. His presence alone signaled outcomes. Women noticed him everywhere. Not loudly, not desperately, but in the subtle ways that mattered, lingering glances, softened posture, strategic proximity. Mike understood attraction the same way he understood negotiations. Desire was transactional. Attention flowed where power rested. He did not seduce, he selected. And selection always came with expectations, mutual benefit, mutual convenience, mutual exit when interest expired. He had never needed to chase anyone. Chasing implied uncertainty, and Mike Johnson did not move without leverage. He chose, and choices responded. That was how the world worked, or at least how his world worked. Refusal, when it occurred, was rarely direct. It arrived dressed as scheduling conflicts, polite distance, or carefully worded boundaries that dissolved once pressure was applied. People learned quickly that standing in Mike's way, romantically or otherwise, came at a cost. Careers stalled. Opportunities evaporated. Doors closed without explanation. He did not threaten. He simply existed, and consequences followed. This was not cruelty in his mind. It was cause and effect. Mike's daily life ran on efficiency. Early mornings, controlled workouts, tailored routines that left no room for excess. His personal spaces were clean, modern, restrained, nothing ornamental, nothing unnecessary. Comfort was designed, not displayed. He valued silence, precision, and environments that reflected his internal order. Emotion to Mike was something to be managed. He experienced attraction, pleasure, satisfaction, but never dependence, never vulnerability. He had learned early that attachment complicated focus, and focus was everything. Relationships, like partnerships, had terms. When the terms expired, he moved on without regret. That was why he had never lost. Loss required attachment, and attachment required surrender. Yet even men like Mike lived in proximity to other worlds, spaces adjacent to their empire but not owned by it. Legal offices, consulting firms, independent agencies, specialized professionals who collaborated without belonging. These spaces existed in parallel, close enough to observe power but distant enough to resist it. It was in one of these parallel spaces that Sharon Marvel existed. She did not enter Mike's awareness loudly. There was no dramatic moment, no immediate collision of attention. She appeared first as an absence, a gap where interest usually bloomed. Early 30s, composed, deliberate, and professionally insulated from the ripple effect of his reputation. She worked within a field connected to his business interests but not controlled by them, close enough to cross paths, far enough to remain untouched. Sharon carried herself with a calm that did not seek validation. Her independence was not performative. It was settled, internal, and unbothered. She did her work, maintained her boundaries, and left spaces without lingering. Money did not impress her. Status did not soften her posture. Influence did not alter her expression. In rooms where Mike's presence shifted gravity, Sharon remained steady. At first, he noticed her because she did not notice him. Not in the way others did. Her eyes did not search for his reaction. Her attention did not recalibrate around his movements. She acknowledged him when necessary, professionally and neutrally, and then returned to her focus. There was no curiosity, no subtle invitation, no silent negotiation. Distance. It was unfamiliar, not offensive at first, just unexpected. Mike was not a man accustomed to questioning the shape of his influence. His life had reinforced a simple truth: power attracted, money persuaded, control prevailed. Sharon Marvel existed as an exception he had not requested. He observed her without intention at first, the way one notices a pattern that does not fit the equation. She moved through shared spaces with quiet certainty, uninterested in proximity. Her independence did not feel rehearsed. It felt earned. There was no attempt to stand out, no effort to be remembered, and yet she lingered in his awareness longer than anyone had in years. Still, Mike did not pursue her, not yet. He did not chase anomalies. He waited for them to correct themselves. But time passed, and Sharon did not adjust. She remained outside his orbit, untouched by his gravity. And somewhere beneath his discipline, beneath the certainty that had defined his success, a subtle tension formed, not desire alone, but resistance. For the first time in a long time, Mike Johnson encountered something he could not immediately account for. And though he did not yet recognize it as loss, the conditions for it had quietly begun. Sharon Marvel had learned over time how to exist without announcing herself. It was not invisibility she practiced, but precision, knowing exactly how much of herself to offer to a space and no more. At 32, she had settled into a rhythm shaped by experience rather than ambition alone. Her work mattered to her, not because it placed her near power, but because it allowed her independence. She operated in a professional sphere that intersected with Mike Johnson's empire often enough to require collaboration, yet remained structurally separate. She answered to no one inside his world, and that separation was intentional. Her career had been built carefully, step by step, without shortcuts. She valued competence over recognition, consistency over spectacle. Sharon did not decorate her success or speak about it often. She preferred outcomes to announcements. Those who worked closely with her respected her clarity, her boundaries, and her refusal to blur lines for convenience. She delivered results, then stepped back into her own life without expectation of praise. Unlike many around Mike, Sharon did not orbit influence. She acknowledged it when necessary and moved past it when it was. She understood power well enough to know that proximity could be dangerous when mistaken for protection. She had watched too many people confuse access with safety, attention with intention. Sharon did not make that mistake. Her personal life mirrored the same restraint. She valued solitude without isolation, connection without dependency. Her evenings were quiet by choice, filled with routines that grounded her, work completed, thoughts organized, emotions kept honest but private. She was not closed off, she was selective, and that selectivity had cost her relationships she refused to mourn. When Sharon crossed paths with Mike Johnson again after their first indirect encounter, nothing in her behavior shifted. She did not prepare herself differently. She did not rehearse composure. She did not register anticipation. To her, he was simply another powerful man accustomed to being centered by the world. She had met enough of them to know the pattern. Mike, however, noticed her more clearly now. Not because she demanded attention, but because she declined to respond to it. In shared professional settings, Sharon remained focused, efficient, untouched by the subtle theatrics that often surrounded him. She did not adjust her posture when he entered. She did not seek alignment with his opinions. She listened, processed, contributed when relevant, and disengaged without ceremony. There was something deeply unsettling about her neutrality. Mike began to observe the details he usually ignored in people. The way Sharon moved through space with intention rather than performance. The absence of calculation in her expressions. The fact that she never lingered near him longer than necessary. Even her silence felt deliberate, not submissive. He was used to admiration wearing different disguises, professional respect, intellectual curiosity, strategic alliance. Sharon offered none of them beyond what the situation required. She did not resist him openly, but she did not yield either. She existed adjacent to his influence, not beneath it. For a man who measured environments instinctively, this imbalance stood out. Sharon, for her part, was aware of Mike Johnson in the same way one is aware of whether present, impactful but not personal. She understood his reputation. It was impossible not to. His name carried weight in rooms before he arrived. She had seen how people recalibrated around him, how decisions softened in his favor, how confidence dissolved into accommodation. She also knew herself well enough to recognize the subtle pressure such men exerted, often without intention. Influence had a way of pressing against boundaries simply by existing. Sharon's refusal to be impressed was not defiance, it was self-preservation. She had learned early that power, when unexamined, often mistook access for entitlement. Men who believed the world responded to them struggled with limits they had not set themselves. Sharon had no interest in becoming a lesson or a conquest. Still, she noticed him. Not romantically, not with curiosity, but analytically. Mike Johnson was composed, undeniably attractive in a controlled, distant way. His confidence was not loud, but it was absolute. There was an efficiency to his presence that suggested a man accustomed to outcomes. Sharon recognized that kind of certainty. She had seen what it did to people who lived too close to it. So she kept her distance. That distance, however, began to shift the balance Mike relied on. He found himself tracking her movements unconsciously, when she entered, when she left, how she positioned herself away from his gravitational pull. He noticed that she never angled for advantage, never sought visibility through proximity. In meetings, her contributions were concise and unembellished. She did not speak to be heard, she spoke to be accurate. This was not indifference born of ignorance, it was informed restraint. Mike told himself he was only curious. Curiosity was acceptable. It did not threaten his control, but curiosity grew teeth when it lingered, and Sharon lingered in his thoughts longer than logic justified. She was not part of his world, and that was precisely the problem. Mike's life had been built on expansion, acquiring, influencing, integrating. Sharon represented a boundary that did not invite negotiation. She existed just outside his reach, close enough to observe, distant enough to remain unchanged. For Sharon, the tension was subtler. She sensed his attention eventually, not as pursuit but as awareness. The shift did not alarm her, but it sharpened her caution. She had no intention of being drawn into dynamics she had worked hard to avoid. She continued as she always had, professional, composed, uninterested in power games disguised as charm. What neither of them acknowledged yet was that something had already changed. Mike Johnson, the man who never chased, had begun to notice a woman who refused to move closer. And Sharon Marvel, the woman who valued her distance, was now standing within the line of sight of a man unaccustomed to limits. The space between them remained intact for now. But unfamiliar territory has a way of inviting movement. Mike Johnson did not approach situations impulsively. Even his personal decisions followed an internal logic shaped by experience and outcome. By the time he chose to acknowledge Sharon Marvel directly, the decision had already been weighed, justified, and stripped of uncertainty. He did not see it as pursuit. In his mind, it was alignment, two professionals occupying overlapping spaces, a conversation waiting to happen. The setting was ordinary, intentionally so, a professional environment where interactions were expected and neutrality was the default. Mike understood optics. He did not leverage spectacle or surprise. He positioned himself within proximity that allowed for natural engagement, confident in the familiarity of how these moments usually unfolded. Attention followed him instinctively. It always had. What he expected was simple: curiosity, perhaps guarded interest, a shift in energy that acknowledged his presence beyond obligation. At the very least, recognition of who he was and what that meant. What he encountered instead was something far more disruptive. Sharon acknowledged him with calm professionalism, nothing more. Her focus did not waver. Her body language did not open. There was no subtle recalibration, no softening, no invitation disguised as politeness. When the moment presented itself, when engagement could have crossed from professional necessity into personal territory, she closed it with clarity. The refusal was not dramatic. It was not defensive. It did not come with hesitation or apology. It arrived cleanly, firmly, and without emotional residue. Sharon did not explain herself beyond what was necessary. She did not negotiate. She did not leave space for reinterpretation. For Mike, the impact was immediate and unfamiliar. He was not accustomed to direct refusal, not in this form, not without context he could influence. His mind searched for explanation automatically, miscalculation, misunderstanding, timing, but none of those fit. Sharon's response had been too composed, too deliberate. This was not a reaction, it was a position. Something shifted inside him, subtle but undeniable. It was not attraction alone that flared. It was offense, not wounded pride but disrupted expectation. The kind that unsettles a system rather than bruises an ego. Mike had built his life around predictability. He understood variables, contingencies, leverage. Sharon's refusal introduced a variable that did not respond to pressure or incentive. She had said no. Not symbolically, not temporarily, not as a tactic. A real no. Mike maintained his composure externally. Years of discipline ensured that no internal disruption ever reached his expression. He did not react, did not insist, did not escalate. He acknowledged the boundary and disengaged with practiced control. To anyone observing, the interaction was unremarkable, two professionals crossing paths and moving on. But internally, the moment echoed. Mike replayed it later, not obsessively but analytically. He examined her posture, her tone, the absence of emotional charge. Sharon had not rejected him as a man. She had declined him as an option. The distinction mattered. It stripped the encounter of personal insult and replaced it with something more unsettling: choice. She had not been intimidated by his presence. She had not been swayed by his influence. She had not calculated potential benefit. She had simply decided. For a man used to being desired by default, this was a fracture in the narrative he had lived inside for decades. Mike did not define himself by approval, but he had always understood it as a natural consequence of his position. Sharon's refusal challenged that assumption without confrontation. Meanwhile, Sharon walked away without looking back. To her, the interaction confirmed what she already knew. Mike Johnson was accustomed to access, and access often blurred into expectation. Her refusal was not an act of rebellion, it was maintenance. A reinforcement of boundaries she had learned to protect carefully. She felt no rush afterward, no lingering tension, no need to process the encounter beyond acknowledging it had occurred. Sharon had said no many times in her life, to opportunities, to people, to dynamics that threatened her autonomy. This was no different. What she did not consider was how unfamiliar her response was to him. Mike carried the moment into his evening, where silence usually reset his focus. Instead, it sharpened his awareness. He found himself questioning details he would normally dismiss. Why had her refusal felt so final? Why had it unsettled him rather than fade into irrelevance? He was not angry. Anger implied loss of control. What he felt was closer to irritation mixed with intrigue, a recognition that something had resisted him without effort. Sharon had not positioned herself against him. She had simply stepped aside, leaving him without leverage. This was defiance without aggression, and it challenged him more than open resistance ever could. Mike reminded himself that not every refusal required response. He had no obligation to pursue someone uninterested. That logic had served him well. Yet the logic faltered here, not because Sharon mattered yet, but because the refusal disrupted his understanding of himself. He had always believed that power attracted, that certainty persuaded, that presence alone created opportunity. Sharon Marvel existed as proof that this belief was incomplete. The realization did not soften him. It sharpened him. For Sharon, the days that followed remained unchanged. She continued her work, maintained her routines, and guarded her peace. She did not speak about the interaction. She did not revisit it mentally. If anything, she felt relief. Clarity established early prevented complications later. But clarity, while protective, does not exist in isolation. Mike Johnson had encountered something he could not categorize or correct. And though he had not yet admitted it to himself, the refusal had crossed a line, from professional anomaly to personal challenge. This was no longer about interest. It was about defiance. And defiance, when it went unanswered, had a way of demanding attention. Mike Johnson told himself the moment had passed, that the refusal, while unusual, belonged in the category of minor disruptions, an anomaly best left unexamined. He had built his success on the ability to discard what did not serve a purpose. Sharon Marvel, by every rational measure, should have faded into that category. She did not. Instead, she lingered at the edges of his awareness, not as a desire demanding pursuit, but as a question that refused resolution. Mike was unaccustomed to unanswered questions, especially ones that involved him. He replayed the interaction not with emotion but with scrutiny. The refusal had been clean, final, free of tension. That, more than anything, unsettled him. Curiosity, he decided, was harmless. It did not imply intention. It did not compromise control. So he watched. Not overtly, not intrusively. Mike observed Sharon in the same detached way he assessed markets before an acquisition, quietly, patiently, waiting for patterns to emerge. He noticed how she navigated professional spaces without aligning herself to power. She did not seek endorsement. She did not trade proximity for advantage. Her work spoke for her, and when it was done, she withdrew without seeking validation. There was a discipline to her independence that Mike recognized instantly. It mirrored his own, though shaped by different battles. Sharon carried herself with a self-respect that did not ask permission. It was not defensive or rigid. It was settled. She spoke when necessary, listened when appropriate, and disengaged when boundaries were met. She treated everyone with the same measured courtesy, including him. That consistency stripped him of the distinction he was used to carrying. She treated him like a normal man. The realization struck deeper than he expected. Mike had grown accustomed to being managed emotionally by others, admired, deferred to, cautiously approached. Sharon offered none of it. Her neutrality was not dismissive. It was intentional. She did not need to assert distance because she lived inside it comfortably. The more Mike observed, the more the curiosity shifted. It was no longer about the refusal itself, but about the woman who had delivered it so effortlessly. He noticed the absence of performance in her behavior. She did not adjust her tone based on audience. She did not soften around authority or harden around competition. Sharon was the same everywhere. Consistency, Mike knew, was rare. What unsettled him most was how her presence began to alter his internal landscape. He found himself anticipating her arrival in shared spaces, registering her absence when she was not there. These were not habits he recognized in himself. Attraction, when it occurred, was usually immediate and contained. This was slower, quieter, more invasive. It crept in through observation rather than desire. Sharon, meanwhile, remained unaware of the shift she was causing. Or perhaps she sensed it and chose not to acknowledge it. She continued as she always had, focused on her work, her routines, her life outside the gravitational pull of powerful men. If she noticed Mike's increased awareness, she did not respond to it. That too was deliberate. Mike's curiosity crossed a threshold when he began to notice how she responded to others. Sharon was not cold. With colleagues she trusted, there was warmth, measured, genuine, unforced. She listened attentively. She laughed softly without seeking attention. Her ease was selective, not scarce. The realization was sharp. Sharon was capable of closeness. She simply did not offer it indiscriminately. This shifted something fundamental in Mike's perception. For the first time, he wanted something that could not be acquired through influence or expectation. Sharon's interest, if it ever came, would have to be given freely. The idea was both unsettling and intoxicating. Mike began to question his own patterns, not in a dramatic, self-reproachful way, but with the same analytical honesty he applied to failing strategies. How many women had he known without ever truly knowing them? How many connections had been built on access rather than intention? He had always believed he was honest about his limitations. He did not promise what he could not sustain, but he had also never examined the imbalance of power that framed his relationships. Sharon represented a mirror he had not asked for. Her distance forced him to confront the difference between being wanted and being chosen, between admiration and interest, between access and consent. The distinction mattered more than he was comfortable admitting. There were moments brief, unguarded, when their paths crossed in silence, passing in hallways, sharing space without obligation to speak. In those moments, something unspoken settled between them, not tension exactly, but awareness. Mike sensed it not as an invitation, but as acknowledgement. Sharon knew he was there. He knew she knew, and still she did not move closer. The restraint was intimate in its own way. Mike felt a pull he could not define. It was not hunger. It was not conquest. It was the desire to be seen without the armor of power, to exist in a space where his name did not precede him. Sharon's refusal had stripped him of advantage, leaving only himself. For a man who had built everything on leverage, the vulnerability was unfamiliar. Sharon, for her part, felt the shift too, subtle, persistent, impossible to ignore completely. Mike's presence had changed, not in proximity but in attention. There was a steadiness to it now, less entitlement, more observation. It did not alarm her, but it sharpened her awareness. She reminded herself of the line she had drawn. Distance was safety, independence was peace. Still, she could not deny that Mike Johnson was different from the men she had learned to guard against. His restraint, his silence, his refusal to push, these were not tactics she recognized. And yet, experience had taught her that control often wore many disguises. So she remained still. And Mike, standing on unfamiliar ground, did something he had never done before. He waited. Not because he lacked opportunity, but because, for the first time, he understood that what he wanted could not be taken, only offered. And that realization marked the moment when curiosity stopped being harmless. It became personal. Sharon Marvel did not believe in dramatic backstories. Life, in her experience, did not break people loudly. It wore them down quietly, through repeated lessons that reshaped priorities and hardened boundaries. The walls she carried were not visible, not rigid, but deliberate, built from memory, reinforced by choice, and maintained through discipline. Her past had taught her the cost of proximity to power. Earlier in her career, she had learned what it meant to be noticed by men who confused influence with intimacy, opportunities that arrived wrapped in expectation, support that came tethered to obligation, care that slowly revealed itself as control. None of it had been overtly cruel. That was the danger. It had been subtle, patient, framed as generosity. By the time Sharon recognized the imbalance, she had already paid for it with her peace. She learned then that autonomy was not something granted, it was something defended, that boundaries were most tested by those who claimed to respect them, that the men who spoke most convincingly about protection often meant possession. Sharon had walked away from situations that promised comfort but demanded compliance. She had chosen uncertainty over captivity, self-trust over security. Those choices shaped her. She did not resent power, but she did not romanticize it either. She understood how easily admiration became leverage, how quickly appreciation could be weaponized. So she built a life where no one held enough influence to corner her. Financial independence, professional separation, emotional restraint. These were not reactions, they were strategies. Mike Johnson, whether he realized it or not, stood at the edge of those walls. From his perspective, Sharon's distance had begun to feel intentional in a way that demanded understanding. He sensed that her refusal was not about him personally, but about something older, something deeply ingrained. That realization softened his irritation and replaced it with respect he had not anticipated. He noticed how carefully she guarded her time, how she exited conversations before they drifted into familiarity, how she never lingered in spaces where dynamics could shift without consent. Sharon did not wait for discomfort to arrive, she prevented it. Mike found himself reflecting on the women he had known, how easily access had been mistaken for intimacy, how often admiration had substituted for understanding. He had always believed himself honest about his intentions, but Sharon's presence forced a deeper question. Honesty did not erase imbalance. Consent did not exist in a vacuum when power tilted the ground beneath it. This was not a realization that arrived with guilt. It arrived with clarity. Mike began to see his past relationships not as failures, but as incomplete equations. Desire had been mutual, but context had never been equal. Sharon's refusal had stripped away the illusion that he had always been chosen freely. That awareness unsettled him more than rejection ever could. Sharon, meanwhile, sensed the shift in him without trusting it. Experience had taught her that introspection did not always lead to change. Men often recognized patterns without relinquishing them. Awareness, while valuable, was not transformation. Still, she could not ignore the difference. Mike's attention had become quieter, less intrusive. He did not insert himself into her space or attempt to redirect her path. His presence felt observant rather than expectant. That distinction mattered, even as Sharon kept her distance. She found herself noticing details she had previously dismissed. The restraint in his movements, the absence of performative charm, the way he seemed to listen more than he spoke, as if recalibrating something internally. These observations did not soften her boundaries, but they complicated her certainty. Sharon valued peace above all else. Peace to her meant predictability, autonomy, and the absence of emotional debt. She had built her life carefully to protect that equilibrium. Mike Johnson represented disruption, not because he pursued her, but because he made her question the simplicity of her distance. She reminded herself that complexity was not always opportunity. Sometimes it was a warning. Mike, on the other hand, felt something unfamiliar take root. The desire to be understood without advantage, to be met without expectation. Sharon's walls did not invite conquest, they demanded respect. And respect, he realized, was something he had rarely been required to prove. This was no longer about attraction. It was about identity. He began to recognize how often his life had been shaped by compliance, how rarely he had been challenged to exist without the buffer of power. Sharon's autonomy highlighted a version of himself he had never needed to develop, a man whose value was not amplified by influence. That realization did not weaken him, it exposed an absence. Sharon's past had taught her to recognize patterns early, and she watched Mike carefully for signs of entitlement resurfacing. She looked for pressure disguised as patience, persistence framed as interest. She found none. Instead, she found stillness. Stillness, she knew, could mean many things. She did not lower her guard. The walls remained intact, but she allowed herself to acknowledge the complexity of the situation. Mike Johnson was not forcing entry. He was standing at the boundary, uncertain, unarmed, and perhaps for the first time, unprotected by his usual tools. That knowledge unsettled her more than overt pursuit would have. For Mike, the realization that this was no longer a chase marked a turning point. He was not trying to win Sharon Marvel. He was confronting himself, examining the structures he had relied on, the assumptions he had never questioned. Sharon's existence outside his control forced him to reckon with the difference between desire and entitlement. The walls she had built were not meant to keep him out. They were meant to keep her whole. And standing before them, Mike Johnson began to understand that crossing them, if it ever happened, would require something he had never had to offer before. Equality. The shift between Mike Johnson and Sharon Marvel did not announce itself with a defining moment. It unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly, through changes so subtle they could only be felt in retrospect. What once existed as distance shaped by caution began to hold a different quality, not reduced, not crossed, but charged. The space between them grew dense with awareness. Their interactions, still limited and professional, carried a new weight. Conversations extended a few seconds longer than necessary. Silences stretched without discomfort, yet refused to dissolve. There were moments when words hovered unspoken, when glances lingered just long enough to suggest thought without revealing intent. Nothing explicit occurred, and yet everything felt deliberate. Mike was acutely aware of the shift, though he did not attempt to define it. Desire in its familiar form had always been immediate and actionable. This was different. It was restrained, patient, and unsettling. Sharon did not invite pursuit, and Mike did not impose it. Instead, something quieter took shape, an attraction that existed without permission to move forward. For the first time, Mike wanted without control. The realization disturbed him more than he expected. Control had always been his anchor. In business, in relationships, in self-definition. To want something without leverage, without strategy, without certainty, it exposed him to vulnerability he had long avoided. Sharon's presence demanded restraint not because she enforced it, but because she required it. He noticed how easily she withdrew when conversations edged toward familiarity. Not abruptly, not defensively, just enough to remind him that access was not assumed. Sharon never rewarded persistence with proximity. She never softened boundaries to accommodate interest. And yet, she did not retreat entirely. That balance fascinated him. Sharon, for her part, felt the tension clearly, even as she refused to indulge it. She was aware of the near moments, the slight pauses where something might have been said, the closeness that almost became intimate before resolving back into neutrality. She felt the pull, undeniable and inconvenient. Mike Johnson was not indifferent to her, and she was no longer indifferent to him. That acknowledgement unsettled her. Desire had always been something Sharon approached cautiously. She understood its power to blur judgment, to erode boundaries that had taken years to construct. She had promised herself that attraction would never override autonomy. And yet, the tension between them did not feel predatory or rushed. It felt patient. That patience made it harder to dismiss. Mike began to notice how Sharon responded to emotional space. She did not fill silence unnecessarily. She allowed moments to exist without explanation. When he spoke, she listened, not with curiosity about his status but with attention to his words. It was a small distinction, but it mattered. Sharon engaged with the man, not the myth. That engagement, limited as it was, awakened something unfamiliar in him. He found himself wanting her approval, not as validation but as recognition. He wanted to be seen without the distortion of power. He wanted her choice, freely given, without pressure or persuasion. The desire terrified him in its purity. Sharon refused to be rushed, and Mike did not attempt to rush her. He felt the instinct to move closer, to define the connection, to claim clarity, but he resisted it. This restraint was not strategic. It was necessary. Anything else would fracture the fragile equilibrium that had formed. There were moments when their hands nearly touched, passing documents, sharing space too small for distance to remain comfortable. In those moments, awareness surged, sharp and electric, only to settle back into stillness. Neither crossed the line. Neither pretended the line did not exist. The restraint itself became intimate. Mike struggled privately with the unfamiliar nature of his desire. He had always believed himself disciplined, but discipline had never required denial before. This was not abstinence. It was respect. Sharon's autonomy demanded it, and he found himself unwilling to violate that demand. He realized then that he was afraid. Not of rejection. He had already survived that. He was afraid of what it meant to want someone who could walk away without consequence. Sharon did not need him. She did not rely on his world. If she chose him, it would be because she wanted him, not because it benefited her. That truth stripped him of armor. Sharon, sensing the depth of his restraint, found herself questioning her assumptions. She had expected pressure, expectation, entitlement. Instead, she found consideration. Mike did not test her boundaries. He honored them even when it cost him proximity. That honor complicated her certainty. She was drawn to his restraint, to the effort it clearly required. She recognized the discipline in it, the conscious decision to step back rather than forward. Still, she refused to mistake effort for transformation. Desire, she knew, could motivate restraint temporarily. True change revealed itself over time. So she held her ground. The tension remained, unspoken and unresolved. It did not explode into drama or collapse into distance. It existed, steady, charged, demanding awareness. Both of them felt it, and both of them chose not to act on it. For Mike, this was the hardest part. He wanted Sharon, but he also wanted her consent, uncompromised, unpressured, unearned by influence. The paradox terrified him. Desire without dominance forced him to confront the limits of his identity. Who was he without control? Who was he when he could not claim what he wanted? For Sharon, the tension tested her resolve. She wanted connection, but not at the cost of her autonomy. She wanted intimacy, but not submission. Mike's restraint invited trust, but trust was something she granted slowly, if at all. They stood at an impasse shaped not by conflict, but by choice. Neither crossed the line. And in that restraint, something deeper began to form, fragile, unspoken, and dangerously real. Desire had arrived, but control had been left behind. Even the most careful boundaries can be tested without warning, and Sharon Marvel's walls were no exception. She had maintained distance with precision, but life, as it always does, complicated the simplicity she sought. Mike Johnson had observed, restrained, and recalibrated. He had waited patiently for her to reveal herself in her own time, but the line between patience and presumption blurred in ways neither of them anticipated. The moment came not with confrontation, but with what seemed at first like generosity. Mike, in his characteristic way, noticed an opportunity to help, a professional advantage he believed would benefit her. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone else, framed as assistance without strings. But to Sharon, it felt different. It was influence, reaching across the boundary she had carefully constructed. He had acted without consultation, without invitation, assuming alignment because he believed he could provide value. Sharon recognized the pattern instantly. Power disguised as care had been the source of her caution in the first place. She felt the pull of his gesture, not because it was harmful in itself, but because it threatened her autonomy. In that moment, she saw clearly that despite the restraint he had shown so far, the old habits, the expectation of compliance, the subtle pressure of influence were still present. She did not hesitate, she chose herself. Walking away was not dramatic, not performative. It was quiet, decisive, and final. She withdrew from both the interaction and the space he occupied. No lingering explanations. No appeals. No reopening of doors he had not earned the right to cross. Sharon had built her walls to protect the life she had shaped carefully. She refused to compromise, even for a man who seemed different in many ways. For Mike, the withdrawal was a shock he had not fully anticipated. Not because he was used to rejection, he had been refused before, but because he realized, too late, that he had crossed an invisible line. This was no longer about attraction or curiosity. This was about the cost of assumptions. He had acted as if proximity and influence could translate into alignment, forgetting that Sharon's choice had always belonged only to her. The realization cut deeper than any professional loss ever could. Deals faltered, mergers succeeded, empires shifted, but nothing mattered in comparison to the emptiness of her absence. Mike had never lost in this way. This was not a failure of business, of strategy, or of reputation. This was a loss that could not be bought back or controlled. In the silence that followed, he sat with the unfamiliar sensation of helplessness. He could not leverage time, nor charm, nor persuasion. She had chosen herself, and he had no authority over that choice. For the first time in decades, Mike Johnson confronted a truth he could not negotiate. Some things were not his to take. Sharon, meanwhile, felt no triumph. Her decision was not about proving a point or asserting power over him. It was about preserving the integrity of her life. She walked away calmly, aware of the emotional currents swirling around her. She had long accepted that life sometimes required distancing, even from what might have been desirable. Her choice was not a statement. It was an affirmation. Both of them lived through the aftermath differently. Mike reflected in private, examining the moments, gestures, and assumptions that had led him here. Sharon continued forward, maintaining her routines and the walls that had protected her for years. Yet in that quiet separation, something had shifted, unspoken, undeniable, and permanent in its significance. For Mike, the lesson was humbling. It was not about power, strategy, or charm. It was about presence without entitlement, about wanting without the guarantee of acquisition. Sharon's refusal had forced him to confront a version of himself he had never needed to develop, a man capable of loss, patience, and respect without expectation. For Sharon, the lesson was reinforcing. Boundaries mattered, choices mattered, and self-respect was non-negotiable. She had preserved what was essential, even in the face of a tension that could have seduced compromise. The breaking point, though painful, left both of them changed. One learned humility. The other reaffirmed strength. And though neither could see it yet, that rupture set the stage for something neither could have predicted. The possibility of connection built not on dominance or proximity, but on true equality. The distance between them remained, but it was no longer empty. It held space for reflection, for growth, for understanding. And for the first time, Mike Johnson understood that to truly have someone like Sharon Marvel in his life, he would have to surrender the one thing he had always wielded without question: control. In that quiet aftermath, desire remained, but it was tempered by the realization that no amount of power could force what had to be freely given. And so the stage was set. The next act would demand change, not by strategy or influence, but by introspection, patience, and the courage to confront what desire really required. For the first time in his life, Mike Johnson experienced a kind of emptiness that no amount of money, influence, or calculated charm could fill. He had lost, not a deal, not an acquisition, not even an argument, but something far more consequential: the sense of certainty that had defined him for decades. Sharon Marvel had walked away quietly without spectacle, leaving behind the unshakable truth that some people could not be influenced, negotiated, or managed. At first he tried to rationalize. He told himself that it was temporary, a strategic pause. Perhaps she would reconsider, perhaps distance was a test. But Mike was honest with himself in a way he rarely admitted. Sharon's absence was final. It wasn't a rejection in the conventional sense. It was something far more profound, a refusal that demanded respect and in doing so stripped him of control. Without control, he realized he was exposed. Mike had spent decades building his life around influence, leverage, and calculated outcomes. Every decision had been measured, every relationship managed, every encounter an equation of cause and effect. To lose this way was unfamiliar territory, but it was also instructive. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel, not in bursts of indulgence, but in quiet, sustained reflection. He started small. Mornings became moments of pause rather than action. He traded the rigid routines he usually relied on for spaces where thought could wander. The gym, once a place to assert dominance over his body, became a place to be present with it. Meals, previously consumed between meetings and calls, became deliberate, contemplative experiences. For the first time, Mike Johnson considered the inner architecture of his life, not just the external outcomes. He thought about Sharon, not with frustration, not with desire as he had known it before, but with understanding. She had maintained her autonomy in ways that he had long believed impossible. She had refused him without confrontation, without accusation, without drama, and in doing so, she had demanded the one thing he could not manufacture: honesty from himself. Mike reflected on his past relationships, the women who had admired him, the connections that had faded as quickly as they formed. He realized that he had often mistaken attention for intimacy, consent for interest, proximity for understanding. He had been powerful, yes, but he had never truly been known. And now, confronted with Sharon, he recognized what he had been missing: an encounter untouched by influence, a connection grounded in equality, a desire free from domination. The realization unsettled him. He saw patterns he had never admitted existed. How many moments had been shaped by expectation rather than authenticity? How often had his success inadvertently overshadowed the people he claimed to care for? Mike had believed that power simplified life. Now he saw that it often complicated the heart, that it built invisible walls even when none were intended. He began to dismantle them internally. Mike spent hours thinking, alone, analyzing the assumptions that had guided his life. He considered his tendency to act first and reflect later, his belief that influence could solve emotional distance, and his assumption that desire always led to compliance. These were habits, not virtues, and for the first time he confronted them honestly. He did not seek distraction. He did not throw himself into work to numb the reflection. Instead, he allowed it to unfold slowly, deliberately. Nights that had once been filled with calls, planning, and meetings became contemplative. Silence became a teacher, not a void. In this quiet, Mike began to understand vulnerability, not as weakness but as clarity. He saw that the spaces Sharon had demanded were not obstacles but invitations, opportunities to recognize himself outside the systems he had relied on. He began to see that desire, when stripped of control, revealed truths about character and intention. He was learning patience, a concept foreign to a man who had always measured life in outcomes. He was learning humility, not the kind imposed by circumstance, but the kind chosen through reflection. And he was learning that love or connection was not a transaction. It could not be negotiated or earned through influence. It could only be offered and received freely. Mike also began to examine his personal life beyond relationships. His friendships, his professional interactions, even his solitary moments were filtered through patterns of control he had never questioned. He realized that respect had often been conditional, attention strategically allocated, and trust calculated. The awareness was sobering. And yet it was liberating. He did not rush to act. There were no grand gestures, no attempts to reclaim what had left. He sat with the discomfort, allowed it to reshape him, and considered what it meant to desire without entitlement. Sharon's absence became a mirror, reflecting the parts of himself that had been concealed behind wealth and charm. In these moments, Mike Johnson began to transform. Not superficially, not to impress, not to regain favor, but internally. He questioned his assumptions, challenged his instincts, and let go of the mechanisms that had ensured his success at the cost of intimacy. By the end of this period, he was quieter, more aware, more deliberate. The man who had never lost was no longer defined by his victories. He was defined by his willingness to confront himself honestly, to sit with discomfort, and to unlearn patterns that had gone unexamined for decades. And in the quiet, he realized something else, something he had not anticipated, the possibility of earning connection on equal terms, the possibility of meeting someone without leverage, influence, or expectation, the possibility that desire, untempered by control, could be meaningful. Mike Johnson, the man who had always commanded outcomes, had begun to understand the subtle, radical truth. Some things could not be won. They had to be received. And Sharon Marvel, even in absence, had become the teacher he had never expected to need. Mike Johnson did not plan grand entrances. He did not send gifts, orchestrate apologies, or stage gestures meant to impress. He had tried all forms of influence before and they had failed, because Sharon Marvel had never responded to anything that came wrapped in expectation. This time, he would show up differently, honest, present, and without demands. The first encounter after months of distance was deliberate, yet casual. Mike chose a shared professional space where their paths were likely to cross naturally. There was no announcement of his presence, no orchestrated timing, only the reality of him existing in the same environment as her. And this time, he moved differently. He was quieter, measured, and unobtrusive, not because he feared loss, but because he understood it. Sharon noticed immediately. She sensed the change in him before she allowed herself to analyze it. His posture was no longer rigid with control, yet it was confident in a new, grounded way. His gaze lingered respectfully, not with entitlement but with recognition. His presence, once commanding and almost insistent, now invited observation rather than compliance. It unsettled her, but not uncomfortably. Mike did not speak first. He waited, letting the natural rhythm of shared space dictate interaction. Sharon, accustomed to noticing shifts in people's energy, felt the difference. She recognized that this was the same man she had once dismissed, not weaker, not changed by fear, but altered by reflection. There was honesty in his stillness, authenticity in his restraint, and a depth she had never seen before. When he finally spoke, it was simple, direct, and unassuming. Not a request for forgiveness, not a declaration of desire, but an acknowledgement of the past and a statement of presence. His words carried no expectation, no pressure. They were offered freely, without strategy or leverage. Sharon listened. She had learned to do so carefully. Trust had to be earned in increments, not granted impulsively. Mike's change was evident, but she was cautious. She noticed his effort in subtle ways, the absence of entitlement, the respect in his attention, the restraint that had once been foreign to him. It was different from the control she had resisted. It was deliberate, considered, and unobtrusive. This was the moment of choice, and for Sharon, choice had always been central. She could feel the sincerity of his shift, yet she did not melt into it instantly. Her past had taught her the importance of packing, of maintaining boundaries while testing authenticity. Mike's return was no guarantee. It was only an invitation, one she would approach on her own terms. As days turned into weeks of intermittent interactions, the pattern began to shift. Conversations deepened naturally. Silences became comfortable rather than charged. Shared glances carried acknowledgement instead of presumption. Mike listened with intent, not to impress but to understand. He asked questions about her life without seeking to insert himself. He noticed without intruding. He offered attention without expectation. Sharon began to respond in kind. She allowed small openings, brief smiles, slight engagement, measured conversation. She tested the waters carefully, aware of the power he still carried, but also sensing the difference in how he wielded it now. There was patience in him that had been absent before, and patience was not something that could be faked. It had to emerge from understanding, from the willingness to step aside, and from the recognition that connection could not be demanded. The tension between them, once electric and restrained, now softened into something more subtle, more intimate. Desire was present, but it was tempered by mutual respect and careful navigation. Each choice to engage became a reaffirmation of autonomy, both hers and his. Mike understood the stakes in a way he never had before. Desire without dominance required a level of emotional discipline far beyond what he had practiced. He no longer measured proximity as acquisition. He measured it as consent. Every shared moment became an exercise in balance, expressing interest without pressure, presence without intrusion, care without control. Sharon, in turn, recognized that her walls no longer faced the same threats. Mike's return did not aim to bypass boundaries. Instead, it honored them. His interest was real, yes, but it came without leverage. The man who once never lost was now learning to participate in something he could not command: mutual choice. Slowly, trust began to form, not instantaneous, not naive, not complete, but perceptible. Sharon allowed herself to lean into the presence of someone who had demonstrated change, someone who had endured her refusal and emerged different because of it. And Mike, witnessing this cautious openness, understood the value of patience, humility, and authentic connection. By the time they began spending more time together, it was clear this was no chase. There was no conquest. There was no imbalance. Each interaction was deliberate yet natural. Each choice to engage was free and mutual. The man who had once expected compliance had learned to accept freedom. And for Sharon, the woman who had always demanded autonomy, the difference was undeniable. She saw him as he was, without the distortion of power or expectation. She could choose, fully and without compromise, whether to welcome him closer or remain distant. In that space, careful, deliberate, patient, they began to exist alongside each other, fully conscious of boundaries, fully aware of desire, and fully capable of choosing connection without coercion. Mike Johnson had returned, not to reclaim, but to meet her as an equal. And Sharon Marvel, for the first time, considered allowing someone in without fear of loss of self. The adult tension, the careful negotiation of autonomy and desire, the slow-building intimacy, this was the foundation of something that could endure. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And for the first time in a long time, Mike Johnson understood that real connection was not something to acquire. It was something to be trusted and nurtured, one mutual choice at a time. The world outside remained relentless, but within the quiet rhythm that Mike Johnson and Sharon Marvel had begun to establish, there was space to breathe, to notice, and to exist as equals. Their connection was no longer defined by pursuit, resistance, or strategy. It was defined by choice, every single interaction a conscious decision, unburdened by expectation. For Mike, the shift was profound. He had spent decades accustomed to outcomes, to control, to the almost automatic compliance that accompanied his presence. Sharon had taught him a lesson he could never have learned from wealth, influence, or charm. Love, true love, could not be taken, manipulated, or earned through power. It could only be received, and it had to be mutual. He approached her presence now differently. When he spoke, it was intentional, honest, and measured. When he touched her hand in passing, it was gentle, deliberate, and always with unspoken permission. There were no grand gestures meant to impress or coerce, only small, meaningful moments that reflected the intimacy they were carefully cultivating. Sharon, in turn, had discovered a new kind of trust. She had always valued autonomy, had built a life around self-preservation and careful boundaries. But Mike's return, on equal terms, invited her to experience connection without compromise. She could be seen fully, without losing herself, and he could see her without trying to reshape her. That balance, rare and fragile, became the foundation of their love. Evenings together were simple, walks through quiet streets, conversations over coffee, shared silences that carried more meaning than words ever could. These moments were unhurried, uncontrived. Each one strengthened the trust between them. They learned the rhythm of each other's thoughts, the cadence of each other's emotions, the nuances of desire expressed without domination. There were still moments of tension. Desire did not disappear, it remained persistent and electric, yet tempered by respect and awareness. When it surged, it was acknowledged, not acted upon impulsively. Touches lingered without expectation, glances held weight without demand. It was a dance of restraint and longing, one that neither dictated nor surrendered to. In professional spaces, their connection carried a quiet confidence. Mike did not overshadow her, and Sharon did not distance unnecessarily. Their presence together was harmonious, marked by mutual acknowledgement rather than assertion. Colleagues noticed the change in energy, though few could define it. There was no power play, no drama, only equilibrium, built painstakingly over months of choice and observation. Mike reflected on the journey with a humility he had rarely felt. The man who once had everything, money, influence, charm, realized that the most important acquisition in life could not be bought. Sharon had chosen him freely, not because of who he was in the world, but because of who he had become in relation to her. That choice, he knew, was far more valuable than any business victory, any social recognition, any conquest he had ever achieved. Sharon, meanwhile, savored the absence of compromise. She could be vulnerable without fear, affectionate without obligation, and deeply connected without surrendering autonomy. The walls she had built were no longer defenses. They were scaffolding for a love that could exist without ownership. In Mike, she found a partner willing to meet her fully, without trying to claim, control, or reshape her life. They learned together the profound difference between possession and presence. Mike understood that desire did not give him claim. Sharon understood that trust and openness did not mean weakness. And in that understanding, a new intimacy emerged, one that was adult, conscious, and enduring. There were moments of laughter that came without effort, moments of silence that spoke volumes, moments of touch that carried reassurance rather than expectation. These were the building blocks of a connection neither had previously experienced. It was real, imperfect, patient, and entirely mutual. In time, the world's noise faded around them. Invitations, expectations, and external pressures became secondary to the bond they had chosen to nurture. Every decision to engage, every choice to stay present, reinforced the foundation of their relationship. Love, in this space, was not about dominance or victory. It was about commitment to equality, respect, and shared vulnerability. Mike Johnson, who had once measured life in outcomes and leverage, now measured it in moments of authenticity. Sharon Marvel, who had guarded herself fiercely for decades, now allowed herself to experience closeness without compromise. Together, they discovered the profound joy of choosing each other daily, not because circumstance dictated it, but because desire, respect, and trust demanded it. And so, the man who had never lost and the woman who had always protected herself found something neither could have predicted. A love without ownership, a desire without pressure, a connection built entirely on choice. It was not perfect. There were disagreements, misunderstandings, and moments of doubt. But there was also respect, honesty, and the deep certainty that they had arrived at this space together, willingly and fully. Mike Johnson had everything he once thought mattered, and finally, he had what mattered most. Sharon Marvel had preserved her autonomy, and finally, she had the intimacy she had never dared to hope for. Together, they had learned that love is not a transaction, a conquest, or a guarantee. It is a choice. And in that choice, they were free.